Okay, looks like we're live here, MythVision podcast. What can we learn about Jesus and his life by using the methods of historical materialism? Several scholars and writers in the past have sought to answer this. Some of the first were Albert Kalthoff, forgive me if I butchered their names, and Karl Kautsky. And it was used throughout Soviet Russia and the People's Republic of China in analyzing early Christianity and Jesus. But true biographies of Jesus from a Marxist perspective have been rare in recent years. But that has now changed. This is the first major historical materialist biography of Jesus in the 21st century from leading scholars in the field, Dr. James G. Crossley and Dr. Robert J. Myles, and they present one of the most intriguing and sociologically cogent views of the Jesus movement and Jesus himself. Let's get this party started. I sincerely hope those of you watching today will learn some new things, something you've never heard. It may bring some historical reality to the things we've been reading all along. And I have two amazing scholars joining me. I want to give a shout out to Chrissy Hansen for helping me formulate some of the questions that I put together today. And feel free to super chat yours along the way. We'll try to get to them. With that being said, no more waiting. Here we are with our guest, and that is Dr. James Crossley and Dr. Robert Myles. Welcome to MythVision.
Thanks for having us.
All right, I'm going to walk away, and you guys just handle the show.
Sounds good.
This book. Why did you write this book?
Well, do you want me to take this one first, Robert?
You go for it, James.
I've been interested in historical Jesus for, a long time, since the 90s, and I've been doing work on historical Jesus for the best part of maybe 25 years in some way or other. But I also work in apocalyptic studies, and I also work on English political history, and they're all related, really. But I wanted to write a full biography of Jesus, or the historical Jesus, or something approximating historical Jesus, before I go off and do various other things. And I'd written quite a lot, but I hadn't got it fully there, and I'd worked with Robert before, and Robert had been working on areas I'd not really covered. To take one example, Robert is a big fishing expert. And so I needed his expertise on that, among various other things. And so we talked and we got together and we thought we would like to do a book on historical Jesus that wasn't straightforwardly, sort of a niche academic book, £80 special or whatever, but something that would be a bit more popular, and we wanted to do something that would be in the tradition of, I think you said it in the introduction, in the tradition of historical materialist readings of Jesus, his tradition of locating Jesus in his economic context, social economic context. What are the reasons that give rise to this movement, without focusing so much on the wonders of the great man Jesus and all this kind of thing, to see how this would be understood in an ancient agrarian peasant context, how we can explain it in these kinds of terms, and how it connects with the ongoing movement of history, if you like. And we wanted to write this, and because, as you said rightly in your introduction, this is not something that has been done on the left, in socialist circles or in historical materialist circles, however you want to word it, this stuff has not been done when there was once a really strong tradition. Now it's just overlooked because I don't think anyone, there's no expertise there, or people simply don't want to touch religion when it comes to issues of economics and things like this. Certainly not ancient religion anyway.
Dr. Crossley, is there any way to get the volume up a little? Our audience can't wait to hear what you're saying, and some of them are having a hard time hearing you.
Shit. Oh,
You're good. Don't worry. This is in church.
all right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's keep talking.
I'm speaking words. Do these come across well? I don't know.
That's better. I think that's better.
That should be better, but never mind. Okay, sorry about that.
That's much better.
Do you want me to repeat that?
Oh no, I think you talking about the social historical setting and writing almost. This is something that hasn't been done in the 21st century, the way that you guys are writing this book, correct?
No, and I think that there's been stuff done. There's been some quite interesting stuff done. But I think a lot of it goes in a very sort of soppy, wet, liberal direction. Jesus was a nice hippie kind of guy or whatever. Rather than trying to locate Jesus really much more strictly in the context of his material conditions and how he would react in relation to his material conditions. So a peasant context is not necessarily going to give us hard egalitarian socialist thinking of the modern era or anything like that. It's going to give us the kind of reactions you'd expect from peasants.
Yeah, if I can jump in there, yeah. I think exactly in terms of my own interest in this, it's allowed me to bring two related interests together. One of them that I've had for a while is the social world of early Christianity, of the New Testament. So going back to my PhD work, I was very much interested in the social forces, the material forces around Galilee, around Palestine at the time, and situating the early Jesus movement and the narratives and the Gospels and so on within that kind of context. So I had looked at Jesus's itinerancy, not as this kind of romanticized wandering religious teacher so much, not to deny that may or may not have been, important, but rather to look at his movements around the place in terms of him responding to broader or external social and economic forces. So that's kind of part of the background. And then the other aspect that I've been interested in for a while is critiquing existing historical Jesus scholarship of the past 30, 40 years in terms of how it continuously kind of like romanticizes Jesus, whether economically, politically, religiously, whatever it is. Jesus always seems to be somehow elevated above his context. Even when scholars will talk about the social and economic forces, it's as if Jesus is this kind of entrepreneurial individual who is operating at a kind of different level. He's special in some way. He's different in some way. And so a lot of my previous work for an academic audience has been critiquing that. And then, I knew James was working on this, and we discussed doing a kind of collaborative effort, because I think by melding our two histories and approaches, we were able to produce this unique book about a non-unique Jesus.
I suspect the first question I should ask both of you, you've already mentioned it, but it's worth giving people somewhere to start methodologically speaking. What is historical materialism? How does it work as a method of analyzing history?
Do you want me to take that, Robert? Or...
Just jump in, yeah.
Historical materialism in basic terms is analyzing the historical context in relation to the dominant economic modes of production. And in an even bigger picture, how do you explain the development of human history from ancient societies through to feudalism, through capitalism and future transformations? So what are the economic bases and grounds for this that make human actors behave the way they do and interact with their social circumstances? So that's the very broad understanding of it in these terms. So to narrow this down even further, we would say, well, what are the dominant modes of production in the ancient world, or in the Roman Empire, or in the Eastern Mediterranean? Now, this is quite a difficult question. It's much easier if you're talking about today, so we could say capitalism That's quite easy. Very difficult to work out the specifics, obviously, but generally it's a fairly obvious answer. And there's a number of interrelated answers to that in the ancient world. Is it a dominant slave economy, for instance, or it's not always a opposition to one another, or is, as we like to think of it, in somewhere like Galilee, it would be a tributary system where the money would be at some level funneled off to the aristocracy or Roman Empire ruling class or whatever. But more locally, and this is where we really focus on, is the relationship between town and countryside. So the dominant producers in the ancient world of foodstuffs, produce, all this kind of thing will come from the countryside, and by and large siphoned off by the elites in the towns. And so how does that kind of relationship help us understand the rise of a movement like the Jesus movement? And what we've got in Galilee as Jesus is growing up are two building projects: the rebuilding of Sepphoris, which was raised as Jesus was a child, and the building of Tiberias by the Sea of Galilee. And typically these will extract resources from the countryside and really introduce some degree of significant social and economic change. And we've got some evidence of this. I mean, people argue all the time about whether the standard of living was improved or not, or did it heighten oppression or whatever. I think that's far too simplistic. But we do know that there were people removed from lands and given gifts of land. So it's changing the traditional social and economic fabric of the world when Jesus is growing up, and hence we suggest that ideas of apocalypticism, millenarianism, and practically anything are tied in with reactions to these changing social circumstances.
And along the way, I might pop up. I figure we go through chapter by chapter to kind of like see the things you mentioned in your book, which will remind the new viewers for popping on to get a copy. Of course, it's pinned at the top of the chat. It's in the description. And it also, just keep in mind, you're not only getting a great book and learning great education on understanding what scholars are thinking on these topics, you're also giving the scholars on the screen the opportunity to want to come back and join us here at MythVision. So, introduction. A life and class conflict. If you don't mind, tell us what the introduction is trying to, what kind of road you're ready to pave with this introduction.
I can take this one, James. And I think just tying it back to the last question as well, I think that the last two questions, I think one of the big reasons why we wanted to write this book as well was because there's a lot of misunderstanding about Marxism, class conflict, especially when it comes to Jesus. And so we wanted to kind of set the record straight. And so we launch into the book in the introduction by stating exactly this, saying, look, a Marxist reading of Jesus, doesn't necessarily mean selectively picking out evidence to show Jesus as a socialist. You could do a historical materialist reading of any figure of history, including, say, Hitler. It wouldn't make Hitler a communist. Rather, what it means is situating that figure and the movement they were a part of in terms of the broader social and material forces, the productive forces of their time and place. So that's exactly what our project is seeking to do. That's what we mean by historical materialism. I think the other related issue that we sometimes run into, or misunderstanding that we sometimes run into around class, is this idea that class is unimportant to other factors, but this question of other factors kind of reduces class to this individual identity performance. So I'm a working class person, so I dress a particular way and I speak a particular way and so on. And this is all really interesting stuff, but that's not actually at the heart of what a historical materialist approach is trying to get at, which is to understand how certain ideas, movements, responses emerge out of or are generated by an underlying socioeconomic system, as complicated as that may be. And one point to add to that is that when people, when ideas emerge or people respond to and react to their socioeconomic circumstances. That happens whether we're kind of consciously doing it or not. So one of the other misunderstandings is, oh, you're just saying that the Jesus movement were responding to their socioeconomic conditions, but actually, look, they had religious ideas or they were doing other things. Well, that again misses the point that we are always responding to our material situation, whatever we're doing, all the time.
Right.
We are grounded and embedded within a social and material context, and whether we know it or not, we're responding to that social and material context. And so we dispel a few of those misunderstandings to begin with. Before talking about a couple of the social forces and dominant ways in which reactions to material forces in the first century could be understood, which I'll let James talk about in a minute, like such as millenarianism and banditry, and then before turning to the question of, I suppose, some of the technical questions of sources and the kind of the critical questions of that have been asked by the discipline of New Testament studies itself, in terms of how the Gospels, how the New Testament documents actually relate to the historical Jesus, and what is the historical Jesus.
And Dr. Crossley, before you get into millenarians and banditry, if you don't mind, maybe either one of you want to answer this, but before we answer that question, which is my question, what is class conflict in the early first century in rural Galilee and Judea? We talk about class conflict. What is that using the materialist approach? Before we even get into the millenarians, because they're going to fall within that category, but we need to know what it even is.
Well, I think I'd go back to what I said before, that the change in circumstances, it opens up there's a lot of things that open up, but the idea that the elites in towns will extract surplus and produce and so on from the agricultural workers, for instance, is a class relationship. Now, sometimes there may be little awareness of or care about this. Other times the conflict element will be heightened. And we'll come on to millenarianism and banditry. They are ways of heightening that conflict. Sometimes it might simply just be grumbling and being miserable about your lot. Other times it might be collaboration. Other times it might be opportunism or whatever. But that's the fundamental class relationship, we think, in Galilee at the time. The idea of the producers in the countryside and the elites who extract the surplus, particularly based in the urban centres.
And I think
that's the fund. And remember, there's a whole tradition of, doesn't matter how we map this on into reality, there's a whole tradition of rich exploiting the poor, that sort of language that can be used.
It's a cross-cultural phenomenon. So particularly within like an agricultural an agrarian society, such as within Palestine under the Roman Empire, you can analyze different parts of that through history, and you can see similar exploitative relationships going on between the elites and the non-elites, and it's important to nuance those in the kind of context specific ways, but we can also point to the more general picture and the ways in which you can see cross-culturally similar kinds of protest ideas or movements or phenomena emerging.
I've interviewed Dominic Crossley a few times, and he does something. I'm not saying it's the same exactly, but it seems like he's trying to place Jesus in a historical context in which you're kind of describing here, where he sees Tiberius comes on the scene. The guy takes over the Galilee. I mean, he literally takes the lake, turns it into his. They're taxing fishermen. I mean, it really hurt the poor. And so he sees this kind of movement of Jesus coming out of this kind of social economic crises for those who are in that lower class. And there's that struggle on top of the fact that somewhere around the time when Judas the Galilean's on the scene, there's some turmoil in the air. And in fact, a legion had to come. And so here's Jesus being brought up in this, what seems to be like a big friction between the empire and maybe those who are upper class, to these, what we would call peasants, or people who are not. They're lower class, probably some are slaves, just in a struggling type of environment. That was the way he kind of painted the picture. And it sounded like more realistic. Like that sounds like something's going on here. Is this the direction that you gentlemen are taking?
I think there's I think over the past, let's say, 30 odd years, Crossan raised some very, very significant questions in historical Jesus studies along the lines that you've just said. Now, I may disagree with bits and pieces here and there, but I think the general gist of what he's saying like that is important, and it should have been taken a lot more seriously in historical Jesus studies than it was. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Where historical Jesus scholarship went was, what's the resulting picture that Crossan came up with? It was a cynic-like figure, playful, whatever. And that's what got debated, as well as Crossan's fairly unique-ish, if I can use that phrase, approach to sources. That's what got discussion, because nobody was really, or not nobody, but a lot of the mainstream historical Jesus scholars, Sanders, the Wrights, and people like this, and we're just simply not interested in the social economic context, and they're quite explicit about this in the books, that they're not going to bother talking about this, and this is crucial, I think. And I think what we're doing is, well, and I don't know if I can speak for Robert, I can certainly speak for myself, is I think I would really want to answer Crossan's challenge about locating Jesus in these contexts, but I would answer it in a very different way to Crossan. I think he raised some crucial questions about the economic context that just simply got ignored, and they should never have been ignored. And I'm hoping we can start pushing that debate forward a lot more now. Well, we'll see.
There's so much good stuff here, and I know. Look, I think he was hitting some things that just rung true to me in my head. Yet he kept wanting to, in my opinion, Crossan's an amazing, amazing guy, but he kind of wants to save Jesus from this apocalyptic, really bad look, which I titled this thumbnail pretty raw. I mean, the failed revolution, right? So he wants to go, well, maybe Jesus did, maybe didn't. But if we spearheaded the reality of what Jesus would have been, and that's what your book is showing, I think we're getting closer to what seems to be the situation. And so what is a millenarian? What are the banditry? What is this whole thing? Is this pre-Jesus, pre-Christian? Were Jews millenarians before that?
Do you mind if I just take this one, Robert?
Yeah, you go for it. Can I before you launch into it? I think it's just worth really quickly pointing out that this is exactly right. That this is a big distinction between what we've done and say like Crossan is the emphasis on the apocalyptic and the millenarianism. And I think we do that precisely because the ways in which the early Jesus movement, and Jesus in particular, were responding to their material conditions needed to be culturally credible within a Jewish non-elite context. So I'll say that, and then James can continue with the specifics.
And what I think, I mean, Crossan knows this background, and he's got some pretty good stuff on banditry, and he knows that banditry, for instance, is one way of reacting, one escape route, one way of channeling these kinds of discontent. A bandit can at least promise, whether it's going to happen is another question, of course, but a bandit can promise the opportunity for retribution. You can attack the wealthy. You can become a common thug, thief, whatever, as well. There's a whole range of different types of options for bandits and banditry. There's an option. There's a violent option, potentially violent option, that you can either just right the wrongs, or you can make a living that way. The other often overlapping option is the millenarian, and this is where I think, again, where I depart from Crossan, is that millenarianism is a crucial option at the time. Millenarianism offers a fantastical vision of an alternative world where there's a just rulers, there'll be life of plenty, all these kinds of things. The hierarchy will work in the interests of the peasantry, all this kind of thing, and it will happen. There'll be supernatural intervention or whatever. That and banditry are the two central options open, culturally credible, as Robert said. And where as much as I respect Crossan's work, where I depart from him is I don't think his idea of a sort of playful, egalitarian, brokerless kingdom, I just simply don't think that was a significant option in first century Galilee that would have made much sense. Whereas I think someone steeped in the world of apocalypticism, millenarianism would.
Okay, so just so our audience is on the same page, two things. And I know you're going to address this. I'll say this second. He kind of makes this sharp distinction between the book of Revelation, whoever this author is, from the Jesus movement himself. He almost seems like this is an offshoot. This almost sounds like a remnant to me of like an early, very Jewish apocalyptic figure, rather than saying this is just some offshoot guy who didn't have what was in common with Jesus. That's where I think you guys are both saying, if you're reading the book of Revelation, you're actually probably closer to some of the reality of what the earlier Jesus movement probably was thinking about against Rome, against, the upper class, the rich, those who work with Rome, that sleep with the whore of Babylon, and all the sexual language, the gender language, and all that stuff that plays a role. That's what you're saying actually fits more on Jesus?
I think there's a trajectory there. Yeah, I think there's. Again, Revelation's got its own agenda.
I mean, it's still a later development, but
Got it.
But we might see it as an embellishment or an elaboration on earlier themes. Absolutely.
You can map out the trajectory, and it's not a surprising one, I don't think.
Okay, and then what is millenarianism? Someone might be like, they keep talking about this guy named Miller. So what is millenarianism?
Well, I mean, depends. I'm using it, or we're using it, in the cross-cultural sense, not typically in the sense of the literal sense of, it's a 1,000-year rule or whatever, but more in the sense of a promise of a golden age, the expectation of an imminent golden age, the transformation of the world, those kind of common things that you find in different cultures, different contexts across time, but they used in different kinds of ways, obviously. And this was a classic pre-modern option in agrarian societies for someone like Jesus.
To imagine a new world. So I think it's an ideology or a framework that is attested cross-culturally, but also especially within early Judaism, as a popular way of interpreting social and economic discontent, and dreaming of a way in which the present social circumstances might be radically transformed by a divine being, intervening in human history and bringing about the changes that are required.
Thank you. Going to chapter 2, because I think we milked was it chapter 2? We did the intro? Yeah. Chapter 2, growing up in a gentrifying Galilee. Get the book, everybody, if you're watching this. My question is, what did the gentrification and class conflict in Galilee look like? How would this have influenced Jesus' upbringing? What are some of the events going on that contributed to this? And I think I mentioned just a couple things, but you probably have better actual historical examples you can get into. What was that like? And can you paint a picture for our audience?
Yeah, over a number of decades, there was a long process of what we might call kind of urbanization, urban development across Galilee, across actually the whole of Palestine. It sort of began before the time of Jesus, during the rulership of Herod the Great, who initiated a number of building projects, particularly in Judea. So he founded the city of Caesarea Maritima, where Pilate would be stationed later on. So a major city on the coast, which connected this area by with sea trade routes into the Roman imperial economy. Herod the Great also built a number of fortresses and so on. And most famously initiated the major refurbishment of the Jerusalem temple, which became known as Herod's temple. So Herod the Great dies in 4 BCE, and his kingdom is split among his sons, and one of the sons who inherits is Herod Antipas. So Herod Antipas is the Herod that we hear about in the Gospels as well. When Jesus is an adult, he's the one who arrests and has John the Baptist executed. And in the Gospel of Luke, he also plays a part in Jesus' own trial. And this Herod, kind of following in the footsteps of his father, also wanted to be remembered as this great builder. Over his very long tenure, he initiated two major building projects that we know about. There may have been others, but there were two significant ones. They get mentioned in Josephus's writings. And this included both the building of, or the rebuilding of Sepphoris, which had been destroyed by the Romans following an uprising following Herod the Great's death. So he has it rebuilt and refortified to the extent that Josephus can actually refer to it as the ornament of all Galilee. And remember, Josephus is this elite Jewish figure writing from an elite perspective. When he talks about raising cities, we do need to see this in class terms. Sepphoris was very close to the small village of Nazareth, and the kind of the surrounding countryside, the villages in the surrounding countryside would have had kind of increased economic demands. They would have had to increase their productivity to feed the needs of these new urban environments. The other major urban settlement that Herod Antipas founds in 19 CE. So this is, right before the early Jesus movement is about to start organizing this millenarian response, is the building of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, on the lake, which it's named after the Emperor Tiberius, and to pay homage to the Roman power that backs Antipas's power. And this again allows this policy of kind of Herodian urban development allows them to better exploit the economy. So in the case of Tiberius, you've now got the city dominating the lakefront, which means that better connected elites can extract the wealth that they need to. It puts increased demand on smaller fishermen in smaller villages like Capernaum or Bethsaida or wherever around the lake, who had presumably just been involved in catching enough to feed themselves and their families. Suddenly you're not only sustaining these small villages that they were a part of, but also this massive metropolis on the lake and the elites who live there. The other material factor that comes across in terms of the building of these settlements is the displacement of peasants, the upheavals. So this is something that we don't normally expect to see in some of our elite sources like Josephus. He's more interested in telling us about the great achievements of great men like Herod and so on. But in the building of Tiberias, he actually does mention that the founding that city, the site where it was built, was on an old Jewish graveyard, and Herod actually had to forcibly shift people, including poor people, both in terms of away and to live there. So people were caught up in these displacements. And if you just think about this at a kind of human level, at that concrete level of what this would do to an ordinary person or family being taken off their land, moved around for the whims of these elite building projects, presumably it caused a bit of angst. I don't know. I think the idea that everyone would have been happy with these changes is not really a warranted idea. And with that said, the material effects and the economic effects of these urbanization projects were kind of this double-edged sword, because some people would have benefited from them. So there was it appears there was this overall gradual increase in economic prosperity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the spoils were distributed equally. Mm-hmm. That would talk about everything against everything we know of an agrarian society. So some scholars have tried to point to that to suggest that it downplays the significance of class conflict in Galilee. We say no, that class conflict will be happening irrespective of whether there's an overall increase in prosperity or not, because within a kind of conflict model of the ancient economy, we know that these things are going to create antagonisms. They're not going to be shared equally, and people are going to get upset. And even if their circumstances have for some people have increased, they might want more as well. The idea that people are always happy with what they've got, I think, speaks more to perhaps some of the kind of, elite perspectives of modern day interpreters reading from a position of comfort than the desperation that may have been felt of some of these people who were affected by these urbanization projects in the first century.
And people are acting in the material interests constantly. I mean, they might want more. They might be opportunistic. They might want to take advantage. They might want the elites to die terribly. I mean, this can manifest itself in different ways, but people act in what they often will perceive to be their material interests, one way or another. And I think we've got to get beyond that simplified model of rich people oppress poor people react. It's much more complicated than that. Can I just add one more thing, Derek?
Please.
I mean, amidst all this, we do try to weave in something akin to a conventional biography. Neither of us are particularly confident about how much we can know, but we do talk about things like Jesus's parentage or where he was born, and things like that, as much as we can, which is not very much, obviously. But we try to weave into this sort of as best we can the kind of more conventional details of a biography, but we really wanted to emphasize these kind of material things that are happening. And in this, this is where we try to talk about what role does a figure like Jesus take, and we use the phrase religious organizer, which is comparable to something like the local intelligentsia or something like this. You get lower clergy, for instance, in medieval England acting in this kind of role, where something like discontent in Galilee could remain local and parochial and all this, but you get certain people who take on the role of either a sort of outsider or the local intelligentsia, which, or as what does happen, scribal figures that can allow the ideas to spread and connect amongst different groups, amongst a wider audience.
There's so much to discuss. So I'm going to press forward to the next chapter. And I think this is an interesting one. We're talking about John the Baptist. I think there's a lot of crosshairs here that get discussed. We see him clearly in Josephus. Mark is doing something different with this guy. And somewhat, I mean, there's details that you could say overlap. Then there's details you would say like, well, maybe Mark's doing something different with his narrative. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of comparison there. And you point that that he's not entirely unique, similar to a figure like Banus. Can you comment about that real quick? I'm curious to know about this figure named Banus.
I mean, Banus is a comparable figure in the sense that he goes out into the wilderness and is understood to have lived a kind of ascetic, austere lifestyle and so on. So what someone like that shows is that there are comparable figures in the world, and it's not too unusual to hear of a figure like John. Now, that doesn't mean to say they're identical. John the Baptist clearly had ideas in the direction of similar to Jesus in terms of millenarianism and so on and so forth. There's some interesting comparisons to be made. They can get quite technical. Are they concerned with issues of purity and things like that? That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I can't remember, but I don't think we go into that in any detail. The key thing is, I think, that this is one of those options for a religious organizer. If you want to have cultural credibility as a figure who's got access to the divine in some ways, you can either be a status quo figure who wants to just dampen any unrest, or you could be someone, for instance, in the prophetic tradition, I guess, who's claiming some kind of access to the divine and acting on behalf of the divine and a channel for the divine, but also as somebody who's representative of the populace. And one thing you get with John the Baptist is a comparable figure who, as far as we know, is popular. You get that from Mark, and you get that from Josephus. So we've got two independent references. You can get it as well if you want to push Q, I think. He's a figure who's emerging there when we've also got comparable building projects happening in Judea. Robert mentioned the vast rebuilding of the temple. That would be probably the best example. and creating his own popular movement there. And there's a number of interesting things we can say about John the Baptist. I mean, his death would be as important as any, in that what happens with John the Baptist is he's killed, probably almost certainly, I think, because he's popular. Now, he's probably is preaching that the world will be transformed and everything's going to be put right and all that kind of thing. God's going to intervene. But from the perspective of either Roman or local power or the Roman stooges or whatever, that distinction doesn't really matter too much. You know, if you've got a popular movement out there in the wilderness, echoes of Exodus and things like this, you kill and ask questions later, and you might not even ask questions later. But these are the kind of figures that get killed. We know of others, but I think what is further important, because with John the Baptist killed for believing in something roughly similar to what someone like views attributed to Jesus, it means that someone like Jesus can be killed as well. And this is part, I think, of the reason why we think ideas of martyrdom and death and things like this could actually be quite very early traditions associated with the historical Jesus, or certainly the earliest memories of Jesus.
There's a lot here that's really good, and it's getting ahead of ourselves in terms of what I wanted to get into, but I want to give a shout out real quick to Stephen Bragg. Thank you for becoming a member, Stephen. Good to have you part of the family. And we also had a member join us from the start, race car test pilot. Really appreciate you joining us here at MythVision. So John the Baptist, how did John's beliefs come about?
I watch on you anyway. Sorry, you're shouting out to your old subscribers and that. I like that.
Yeah. You got to multitask. You know, my wife's been trying to teach me. She's like, you need to get better at it. No, you're fine. How did John's beliefs come about? How concerned with the peasantry and its struggle against class oppressions was his movement? Do we have any evidence?
We have. I mean, I think the sheer idea of his popularity. Sorry, I should have cut rub it off then, probably, but never mind. What's he going to do? The popularity of the movement is crucial, and you get this with certain figures that Josephus describes who are popular, and the big emphasis is on the numbers. So the sheer numbers will imply that these people have a following that's not simply elites who are pissed off or whatever with the world. It's got a wider base among the agrarian society to have that. And we do similar things with bandits, similar things with other prophets, things like that. So at least according to Mark talks about, you know, the whole countryside. I mean, it's exaggerated, of course, but they all come out to see him. But this is where Josephus is important, because he's clearly put to death because he's got a popular movement, and that could be perceived to be a threat. So I think we're on some pretty firmish ground there that John had a popular movement and popular support. And the fact that the movement continued may also be an indication of that.
And it's most likely not of elites, I would suspect. This is probably the peasantry.
I mean, this is where it's interesting in terms of the Gospels, say Mark talking about John the Baptist's death and by Herod Antipas. And it raises this whole question of John apparently had been critiquing the elite for their loose morals, marital morals, and so on. And I think it shows again how I think it adds one of these complications to kind of the modern political lens and how it doesn't quite translate to the first century, because John could be incredibly popular among the peasants by appealing to what we would consider to be kind of morally conservative ideas about marital relationships and so on, and then pointing out the hypocrisy of someone like Herod Antipas, right? And saying, oh, he's not living up to the ideals that are grounded in our traditions and so on and so forth. And so we get this interesting blending of what we would consider a kind of moral conservatism or traditionalism with popular revolt and actually class-based antagonism.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that.
And I think that's something that we then continue to see in weird and unexpected and complicated ways with the Jesus movement as well.
Well, that was what my follow-up question is what is the relationship between Jesus and John? I mean, I've had scholars come on, and some of them aren't even New Testament scholars, but they're popular figures who I wanted to get their thoughts about Jesus, if they thought he even existed, all of these kind of things. And some people will say these are two different groups that coalesce by the time the Gospels come on. They want to collab. We need to put our efforts together. And then there's others who think, no, Jesus was like a subordinate in the movement of John. John, he's gone. Jesus takes over. This kind of thing. So what has your research in this approach, the relationship between John and Jesus, what do you see it as?
I think the first,
Go on.
I'm going to cut you off now, James. I think the first thing to say here is that, and I think this will come up in later on as well, that we don't necessarily see these movements as like tightly bounded entities, right? So there could have been a lot of overlap, because this is how social movements are. There could have been people sympathizers to both movements. There could have even been central figures who were central to both movements. That doesn't mean that they were the same movements. That just means that there may have been some overlap. And we think that's probably the most likely situation. It seems that the Gospels are pretty clear that on two things. Firstly, that John the Baptist, there was some kind of overlap between the Baptist movement and the Jesus movement. And secondly, it seems that the Gospels are concerned that John the Baptist's movement may have been more popular, and they need to somehow show that the Jesus movement or Jesus was superior to John. So the Gospels have this idea of John pointing the way to Jesus, not necessarily pointing the way to the kingdom of God or some other event or divine figure. It is Jesus that the authors of the Gospels bring in, as the kind of the successor to and more prominent figure. But that suggests that that the Baptist movement may have been at the time more popular or influential or what have you, and that the Jesus movement needed to create some kind of differentiation from it as it was expanding and growing and trying to clamor for its own credibility.
It also might say, if Jesus is seeing what just happened to John, what might happen to him? Yeah. And so he might be anticipating this. And in the millenarian movement, is there some teaching that we have evidence of where they think that going to their deaths would bring about God's coming?
Yeah, I mean, there's a pretty strong tradition. How it was framed and what it would bring about might be debated, but certainly from, let's say, about 160 plus years before birth of Jesus, you've got the Maccabean martyrs who would die for the law, for traditions or whatever, commemorated annually at Hanukkah. And you've got a very strong, well-known, well-respected martyrdom tradition there. So it's you can frame, if you think your death is up and coming, is it going to be a waste of time, your death, or do you want to make sure it's meaningful? And well, what we do know about such people's figures is that they're, it's hardly unusual for them to attribute meaning to their deaths. And there's the obvious language to use in this context. And there's broader ideas across the Greco-Roman world about dying for cities, dying for people, and things like this. But there's certainly a Jewish tradition of dying for the Lord, dying for this, and to assuage God's wrath or whatever, and help bring about the transformation. Your death to have some value in bringing about the eschatological transformation.
Thank you.
It's certainly there.
It gets a bit tricky to talk about this as well, because martyrdom is and you calling it a martyr comes from the Christian tradition,
right?
But it doesn't mean that similar kinds of ideas or movements, behaviors didn't exist before then. In fact, we see them, as James has just pointed out. So we've got to get past this idea that like Jesus was the first martyr and that he invented martyrdom that later Christian martyrs were influenced by. Of course that happened, but that was just giving a name to something that that already kind of existed within various traditions that they could have pulled on and interpreted their ideas and actions.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Canada Moss's work on the whole myth of persecution, and of course, she goes from Jewish and Greek sources to point out some of that interesting material. Getting into the next chapter, becoming a religious organizer. I'd like to ask you another question pertaining to Levi, the tax collector. What was this role of Levi, tax collector in the Jesus movement? What's this all about? Do you have a certain position you take on this?
Yes.
I know. I'm leading up to get you to tell. I'm like, yeah. So you can tell us. If
Yeah,
you
he was a
like.
good dude, wasn't he? I mean, he was all right.
Striking. I mean, Robert can talk about fishing and things like this, but I mean, others have made the point that tax collecting and fishing are two significant occupations that turn up in the gospel tradition. Now, having a tax collector there might seem an odd one, but we think there's a very good reason for this. Now, whether we can debate all day about whether there was a historical Levi or whatever, but what is clear, I think, is that the Jesus movement was concerned with people like tax collectors, and the other this I think technical term that gets associated with tax collectors is sinner or sinners. And what a lot of earlier scholarship has, for some reason, I've got an explanation for that, but it's for another time, has overlooked is the social economic import of that term sinner and sinners. And if you look at the word in Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, from, let's say, the Psalms, in fact, the Hebrew Bible entirely, through to the rabbinic literature, end of rabbinic literature. So we're talking pretty much 1,000 years here. Consistently, this term is used to describe what are perceived to be exploitative rich people who may not observe the law as they should, people who might act in various ways are given right to seize as immoral, but constantly they're almost comically rich. It's and almost beyond the pale of repentance. Or these people, you know what you're going to get with them. I mean, one writer talks about who pities the snake charmer when the charmer gets bitten by the snake. So don't expect to come out smelling of roses if you hang around with sinners. So it's there's clearly in the gospel tradition this mission to sinners, and we phrase this in terms of mission to the rich rather than a mission to the poor. It's a mission to the rich, and it's to get the rich to repent and give up their wealth before it's too late. And there may be good reasons for this. I mean, how do you fund a movement? Well, there's some strikingly interesting connections with people of wealth and means and so on, which help fund the movement in some ways, and I think also provide some crucial networks for the spread of the movement, along with fishing, and they're both interconnected anyway, I think. So that's why I think you do get figures like Levi associated with the movement. Well, I can't prove who was active where and when, but I think the idea that there were tax collectors and people of wealth associated with the movement is very important. I think when you look at parables like the rich man and Lazarus in Luke, or if you look at the story of the rich man in Mark 10 and the whole story, the eye of the needle and all that kind of thing, you can see a pattern emerging where however we categorize these people, but the poor, whoever they're meant to be, are simply saved because they are. And it's the rich people who are the ones who have to give up the wealth to be saved in some ways. They're bound to sin. I think there is a tradition in early Judaism that if you're rich, you're bound to sin. There's another tradition that if you're rich, that's a sign you're saved. And they're often in competition within Judaism, these two traditions. And I think the Jesus movement represents the idea that that if you're wealthy, you're going to sin. And this is, if we hark back to what we're talking about, what's happening in Galilee, when there's these social upheavals, you can see how this message can take on a certain meaning in that kind of context. So we think there was this mission to the rich, probably, we suspect, not entirely successful. Will you give up your wealth? But we do get stories of Zacchaeus, don't we? So he doesn't give up all his wealth. And I think my best explanation for that is that this is a story created to explain why people weren't giving up the wealth. But anyway, that's why I think stories of tax collectors are associated with this movement.
And before we get your comment on the fishing side of things here, Dr. Myles, I've read Christ Associations by John Kloppenborg, and he is doing kind of this materialist thing, but heuristically to try and show other movements the best we can and how they have factions of kind of like what we have with certain labor groups. If you're my brother, right, he's an actual a welder. Like he's a professional welder. There is a crew and a group of welders that hang out and they have their own little enclaves and whatnot. So in this time, you would have seen the same thing with people who may have been associated with certain types of careers or whatever. And if you take this whole Dominic Crossley, I think with Kloppenborg kind of made me think of this, and I heard it said by one of them, was that you have these tax collectors who are sitting on the Lake of Tiberias, which was the Sea of Galilee or the Lake of Galilee, really. Porphyry criticized them for saying that this was a sea. It was not a sea, but that's a whole nother thing. But I found it interesting that the tax collectors would have been waiting for the fishermen to come and tax them. So there's like this possibility of overlap between both careers, as you have people possibly taxing these people who are coming from the lake. Hey, all right, how many fish did you get today? All right. And
the Gospels associate them together. So
right.
By having the call to discipleship narratives, Jesus approaches the fishermen brothers, asks them to leave their nets and follow him, and they do. And then you have the call of Levi or Matthew, and it's modeled on that same paradigm of come follow me, and they do. And he's within that proximity of the lakeshore, presumably to tax the fishermen. I'll add just to the thing about Levi and why I think tax collectors are so important is exactly this. It's this networking. They would be the most useful figures as kind of mediators between, because they would have had these connections with, say, the fishermen on the lake who they were taxing or others, but also they would have had networks into some of these wealthy elite sinners in the urban environments who were presumably responsible or benefiting from these urbanization projects. And so, this is why I think you have these stories about Jesus dining with tax collectors and sinners. Like the Gospels actually put these two things together.
Right.
And sinners here does not mean, downtrodden outcasts or whatever. It's scandalous precisely because these are the people responsible for, or seen as, regarded as popularly responsible for the problems in that are happening, and the antagonisms that are happening within Galilee.
Mm.
And if they are marginal, they're the way we talk about 1% today, in some sense, they're only marginal because they're better off than everyone else. And if you just have one point to this is how ideas tend to spread as well, whether religious ideas or political ideas, through social networks, through workplace, family connections, things like this, rather than convincing ideas or anything like that. And we do talk about this a little later on as the message spreads. It requires, and you mentioned rightly there, I think it was Kloppenborg's work on Christ associations. What you can do with that kind of stuff is you've got these associations, you've got these trade network, trade groups, whatever. People who one day they'll be active in a synagogue, another day they'll be active in the trade group, and you've got multiple membership of different kind of groups and ready-made networks for a message to spread and things like this. So I think these networks are absolutely crucial for understanding why this movement emerged.
And it comes back to like the failed revolution is what I put on the thumbnail, but it keeps making me think that here are these workers in these associations that are going back and they're biting their tongue till they go back to each other and go, we got to do something about this, or something has to be done about this. God has got to step in and do something. And we see that cry all throughout the book of Revelation. Like, how long, O Lord? Elaine Pagels told me in person, when this person, she imagines walking through the streets of Ephesus, which Patmos would not have been too far, and would have seen the statues of the figurines of the women representing the nations, including the Jews, with Rome putting a knife to her throat as a rape act, as if we have dominated and conquered these 30 nations. Like, do you think that these people weren't going, how long, oh God? Like, you have to come in and destroy these wicked people. And I imagine if there's something like that going on, Allison was critical of Crossan in his Quest for the Historical Jesus course that I showed you before we went live. He was critical of him, saying, well, he thinks Crossan might be using too much of what happened in Ireland with the Irish on the picture of Jesus. But based on our conversation, I'm not going to say they're identical, but maybe you would agree more with what Crossan's actually trying to suggest, that there's a social, political kind of revolution amongst these lower class people against what's happening to them. Not saying it's identical in any way, but like there may be overlap. I don't know.
I think an unholy alliance of Crossley and Allison, and you're getting closer to the truth.
Right? We're trying.
Well, I think you've got Allison on the apocalypticism. He's got plenty of interesting stuff. You've got Crossley on the social context. Got plenty of interesting stuff. We can critique the details on both sides, but I think if you could bring them two together, neither of them may like that. But I think if you do bring them two together, that you can do some interesting stuff.
You guys
I
will
think
be
as
the
well,
two together,
yeah.
right? Sorry.
Yeah, I think just on that point, and you know, I'm responding to what you said, Dale Ellison said, not what Dale Ellison said. So I'm not quite sure where he'd come at with this. But I do think like there's incredible value in looking at a period of history or a particular historical problem through a heuristic lens. I see no problem with that if we are upfront about what we're doing. And, you know, I think that this allows us to shed light on certain aspects of a historical situation that the people even in that time may have not been fully conscious of. And I think this is especially the case in a kind of historical materialist perspective where, you know, we're reading from an entirely different socioeconomic system and world and worldview with our own questions. And we want to be upfront about that. What we're not doing is saying that the early Jesus movement were, you know, like social justice warriors or kind of class warriors or like proto Che Guevara figures or something like that. That's actually, you know, we often, I think this is the biggest misconception that often comes up when you start talking about this historical materialist approach. But rather, in defense of it, what we are doing is simply saying, here's our heuristic, and or here is the set of questions that we think are important to trying to get to the grit of what was going on. And it allows us to take the data and to emphasize certain aspects and to draw certain connections that other people have not been able to manage to do. Of course, we're reading through kind of our own lenses. I don't think that's necessarily a terrible thing, as long as we're not allowing it to kind of dominate the data, as it were.
Just to give a point on what Allison did say, he said, and you can purchase the course and go check out the Quest for the Historical Jesus. It's an amazing course. But in that course, when he gets to Sanders and then Crossley, because he's showing how they play a role in the historical Jesus quest, he says that I think he sides with Sanders on this, whereas Sanders seems to see there's less Roman role in the Galilee, that they have to get called in, like they had no clue this uprising. Finally, they get word, oh my gosh, there's this uprising with this guy, Judas the Galilean, like almost like they don't really even deal with the social life and really are that actively involved. Whereas Crossley, I think he responded to a video. I told him about this after we recorded, and he's like, no. And he's like, are you kidding me? They're on the lakefront. Tiberius is on the lakefront now. Like he is in there. So you could tell they've got some deep discussion that they're interested in probably wanting to have at some point on that matter.
We've got a great quote in chapter 2, and I can't remember exactly what it is, from Sanders, where he talks about the building projects in this kind of romanticized way, where he says, "Oh, all Jews were pretty happy with what was going on. Everybody was peaceful. You know, like they weren't seriously disturbed by these things." And it's exactly one of this. Like he makes this generalization on the basis of a lack of evidence. You know, so he's making a kind of overall generalization about the entirety of the Galilean population supposedly being happy with something.
They're all Josephus. I'm just kidding.
Right. Well, it's like we look at any context, any period through history, and every society is going to be divided by class in some way. There's going to be people who are happy with the situation and people who aren't. So to suddenly say all Jews in Jesus's time were, more or less undisturbed by what was going on, I think that just doesn't ring true at a kind of just common sense level.
And that's why apocalypse and millenarianism is important, because it's not necessarily saying we're going to overthrow the world with our weapons or whatever. That might involve that, but there'll be supernatural intervention that will just that will change things. So I mean, how do you measure that in history? clearly there's discontent in that world if you want the rulers overthrown and replaced by something new. That is some level discontent with the way the world is. So it's not necessarily happy with the way the world is at all. So this is where I think Sanders, I don't quite understand how Sanders can come to that conclusion when at the same time he does have Jesus as this apocalyptic figure. And I think Crossan on the one hand and Sanders stroke Allison on the other are both right in a way. I mean, Sanders is talking on a technical issue about is there, Roman garrison based in Galilee and all this kind of thing. Okay. But to say that Herod Antipas wasn't to some degree answerable to Rome is also, I mean, you can't say that either.
When he named his city after the emperor.
Yeah. So both are right in a way. There's not the direct presence you would get in Judea, for instance, or wherever, but there's an indirect thing with Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas knows ultimately who's in charge, and it's not him.
I tell you I was there. So what's cool about this conversation, and I don't want to sidetrack, is like I was there at Caesarea Maritime and Caesarea Philippi. I saw where the foundation stones are, where they built a temple to Augustus, or Herod built a temple to Augustus right there, where the temple of Pan was, where the portal to the underworld. It was really cool to be in the spot. And the gospel says Jesus was here, and he says, "Who do men say that I am?" I mean, and when you're there and you think about all the sons of gods that are in line right there, here's Jesus stepping up to the plate. It's kind of like, what? Anyway, It might be fictional by the author's, own imagination to try and paint Jesus as his figure, or maybe this guy thought he was more than what he is. But this brings me to the next thing. You brought up millenarianism, and that's the next chapter. Again, another shameless plug. If you haven't got the book, get the book now, or else you will have a failed revolution. And we don't want that to happen to you. Okay. We want to see you succeed. Revolutionary millenarianism. And so my question, and I had two, but I'm going to make it really simple. What was the new golden age after the new theocracy had been installed to look like? So we talk about how God's supposed to come in some versions of this. Obviously we had what seemed to be millenarian Jews who were actively putting a sword in their hand and going to bat for God. Others who thought God would come in. Either way you shake it, because Crossan said they would have just crucified 12 people or 13 people rather than just one if this whole movement was violent at this stage. This is his comment. But let's just say that it is the case that this movement isn't violent yet. They're still projecting that they will be fighting at some point, it seems. At least Revelation does. The saints, the 144,000, like they're going to fight with God and his people against the enemy and draw some blood. What are your thoughts about all this? Am I wrong? Am I right? Is there something you'd want to nitpick about this? And what are their views of that golden age?
Well, I'll take the golden age and I'll let Robert deal with violence. How about
that? Yeah, all right. That sounds good. I'm ready.
Right.
I'll be using a bit of violence if you don't stop.
I'm clipping that. I'm sending that to your boss.
Yeah.
The golden age would involve something like that. I mean, there would be we get this idea of role reversal pretty clearly there in the gospel tradition, and role reversal of rich and poor, first and last, and so on and so forth. There would be the idea of a just king, and you get it's quite a common enough cross-cultural phenomenon. Perhaps this would have been a figure like Jesus. It would have involved. I think there's an early tradition you can argue for the disciples playing a prominent role, the inner circle of them, and the 12 judging the 12 tribes and things like this. This isn't an egalitarian model as such. It's going to be one where justice will reign, people will be treated properly, peasants will be given the food they need, and all this kind of stuff. And I think if you do that with the cross-cultural thing, we can make some general comments like that. Illness will be eliminated, or whatever. You will have there'll be a life of plenty of food. And I remember a debate between two prominent scholars years ago when someone said, "Oh, they can't possibly mean there'll be like 20,000, I don't know, whatever, trees bearing grapes or something." And then the other one just turned around and said, "Couldn't they?" And he went, Oh, maybe, but it would be this. But the basic point is that this idea of we can get this from various Jewish texts that there will be an ideal world, ideal king, justice dispensed, food for all, ailments taken care of, wonderful life, that kind of thing. The way the world should be, things like that. So that's the kind of idea. I think what we need to get away from is the very common view, and I think this is either implicit or explicit in a lot of scholarship, that this would be a nice world of equal people where everyone was equal and everyone would hold hands and or whatever. It's still a hierarchy, and I think that's reflective of a peasant context where you do think in hierarchical terms about even within the peasantry and things like this.
Even with statements like "the last shall be first" is going to say that the first are actually going to be kicked to the back.
Yeah,
so you're reversing roles. Yeah,
you are. And what do you think the kingdom of God is? I mean, one translation is empire of God, a perfectly reasonable translation. Dictatorship of God, dictatorship on the behalf of the peasantry. It's going to replace Rome. It's going to be a new. And from the background from the book of Daniel onwards, the way this is interpreted, this would replace the great ruling power of the time with a new empire, a new kingdom, a new dictatorship, or whatever. It's not. I think we have to get rid of this idea that it was all sweetness, egalitarianism, of sexuality, gender, blah blah blah. That'd be a wonderful thing in reality, but not in that kind of context. That's just not really a significant option in a peasant context, I don't think. Now, there's plenty of other debates around the Roman world where perhaps you can get egalitarianism. There'll be some more debates on that in the future, but I think not in first century Galilee.
Now to the bloodshed. No. Oh, and real quick, Pat, thank you so much for that super chat. I really appreciate it. I want to just shout out to anybody who helps support us. Feel free to send your questions, but we don't have too much more time. I don't want to leave. Look, the reason why isn't because Dr. Myles, Dr. Crossley, it's like early morning for you, and I don't want to have you hate me for the rest of your life. So
that's all right.
You're not sleeping tonight, are you, James?
Not now. Well, I've just seen someone talk about Jimmy Superfly Snooker. So, I mean, as a wrestling fan, how can I?
Yeah, right. So what about the violent side of this ordeal?
Just as you were talking before, I was this quote from, I'm going to not get it quite right, but from Vladimir Lenin came to my mind. It goes something like, the transformation from the bourgeois state to the proletarian state cannot happen without violent revolution. And the point that he's trying to make there is that do you really think that the people who are in charge are going to let you just come and take their power from them? If you are actually truly going to threaten the power that they hold in a real tangible way, so not just in a kind of gestural, playful way or whatever, which, and there's always been room for kind of court jesters or whatever. If you're actually going to go in and seize power, and there's going to be a transfer of power from one political entity to another, expect violence. It doesn't sort of matter where the violence comes from to start with. In the case of the Jesus movement, maybe it started with some antagonists like some members like Simon the Zealot or something, who knows, or if it started with the elites crucifying Jesus or wherever it was. But violence is going to enter the situation at some point along the road. In the book, I think we're quite careful to say that that we don't think that the Jesus movement, the early Jesus movement, were kind of non-violent in this principled way. We think that they had more of and precisely because we just think that would be kind of anachronistic and it's well-meaning and it sounds good, but the members of the early Jesus movement were armed, as we're told in the Gospels, and they likely expected violence, and any appeals to non-violence tended to be kind of for pragmatic reasons. So you don't want to go around needlessly provoking elites, especially when you're trying to win some of them maybe to your side to support the movement. But also, violence, as you say, could wait for the appropriate moment when divine forces would intervene And the bloodshed was going to come sooner or later. It just now wasn't quite the right moment. It was impractical or not a pragmatic reason for bringing in violence into the situation in a kind of organized way at that point in time.
Eventually, no matter what, there was going to be violence, like you're saying, either way. I mean, and even there's at least the expectation that in the end, again, reversing the roles that Dr. Crossley was saying, you have these special Israelites that are virgins, and they're at the top, and then the 12,000 they're singing. Which it is interesting how Jehovah's Witnesses have taken that and like ran with that to make it like we are the hierarchy, and you know if you're not in, man, you're behind us. So I think that fits what you were both describing. I'd like to press on here so we don't keep you too long and you hate me. Family Troubles, chapter 6. Shameless plug. Get the book. In this chapter. Oh, I just want to ask, what did gender and gendered hierarchies in ancient Judea and Galilee look like? What were the disparities and expectations?
I mean, do you want me to start with the basic stuff about households, and then you can move on to the wider ideology and so on?
Sure.
The expectations would involve things like the eldest son being head of a household, for instance. You're expected to take on the role. That kind of role. That's the kind of masculine role that's expected. Now, imagine that in a context where there's been we know there's been upheavals of households in Galilee as Jesus is growing up. So there's people not taking on expected roles, for instance, including Jesus for whatever reason. Maybe he's seeing what's going on around him. Maybe he's forced into it. Whatever. So already that's an expected role. And if you're not head of a household, you up there potentially for ridicule. What we argue is that that does happen in line with what some scholars argue, but we also think that Jesus fights masculinity with masculinity, if you like. So he would see the movement would see their role as itinerant figures out in the desert as a hardened thing. We've got this discussion of how Jesus frames John the Baptist in relation to Herod Antipas, not in the soft clothing. That's probably pretending that the people in soft clothing are somehow unmasculine, unlike the hardened masculine figures like us who can go out in the wilderness and do our thing. So there's a competition of who's the masculine one here and things like this. And that's tied in, I think, with the upheavals and so on and so forth in Galilee with households. So there's some very important stuff there. And this is why you get, I think, this idea of the Jesus movement being an alternative household. You get this idea that when his family are complaining about him in Mark 3, when he says, no, these are my brothers and sisters and so on. Now, there's been some really good stuff done on this before, where the argument is that the alternative family is somehow a kind of queer alternative family that's playing around with gender roles. What we were arguing is that actually the Jesus movement is pushing a more their own version of masculinity. And this, some people argue that this alternative movement doesn't have a father figure, which would be quite shocking. We're arguing it has a very big father figure. So we've got an even bigger father figure than your father figure, kind of thing. So it's a competition over masculinity, and I think this avoids some of the anachronism when people talk about gender in the ancient world. But Robert knows a bit more about this.
I was going to ask Robert, and of course, give your spiel on this, but I did want to mention, look, I see this thing, and I see Jesus talk about you must hate your mother, father, sister, brother, like this us versus them mentality, and I see this almost on a Jim Jones-ish level. I can't say that that's exactly, but it's like it does not seem, and that might be my modern perception here, but it seems like this is splitting up family ties. If you don't line up with what we're doing, say bye to your mother, father. Like, you need to love us and what we're trying to do more than your own blood. And that's very cultic in modern standards, what we would say.
Qualify that a little bit, because I think the parallel talks about love less. And I think this is actually reflects an Aramaic word which is not as strong as the English hate.
Okay.
And I think it's a reflection of it's a known Jewish tradition that you prioritize one thing over family. It's actually to say how important the thing you're doing is, rather than a rejection of family as such. So I don't think it quite goes down the Jim Jones route on this. I think it's more in the tradition of this stuff is even more important than family.
Okay.
so it relativizes family rather than gets rid of it or anything like that. But that's a known tradition, I think. And I don't
if we took that to the next level, though, and the family said, "I'm not on board with what you're doing," or "I don't," then you're stuck having to pick this over your family, right?
Yeah, and I think that does happen. I think that's the sort of social reality that there is a split in family, so they've got to think of ways of conceptualizing this problem, these splits, these divisions, and so on. So yeah, I think you're right there.
Sorry about that. Anyway,
no, sorry. No. I know what you said is a common argument. I think I'm just pushing back against a common argument there. Actually,
I love the pushback. All right, Myles, bring the knuckles.
Yeah, I think just on that, the question of why are the households breaking apart is an important one that can be explored through that historical materialist lens as well. So the texts certainly, the Gospels certainly make out as if, for the most part, this is this division between families is kind of voluntary and chosen, and I think that's precisely because they're being written at a later point in time where this has become a thing that you do. You renounce family and you follow Jesus, and this is the kind of devotion that it takes. Now, those sorts of ideas may have been happening at the time of the early Jesus movement, but I think also, we've got this evidence of from elsewhere of displacements, upheavals, presumably families being broken up or heads of households being, dethroned from their position of heads of households because they can no longer eke out an income and provide for their families and so on and so forth. So that whole material upheaval and so on seems to be part of this picture, I think, even if it gets to a point where the anti-family stuff is then sort of romanticized or adopted in this strictly more voluntary sense later on, and perhaps it was done in that way, we suggest in the book, as a kind of defense mechanism. So they were being ridiculed for being effeminate or unmanly because these people weren't living according to the kind of the gendered expectations of their time and place, where the heads of households provided for families and so on and so forth. So it seems like the early Jesus movement may have started to adopt it and said, well, yes, actually, we're eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven,
Right.
And even that phrase about eunuchs talks about eunuchs who have been made, who were born eunuchs, and then others who are choose to be eunuchs, but also it talks about those who are made eunuchs, right? So there's a few different options kind of blending in there, and of course eunuchs as well often had privileged positions within the royal court. So these eunuchs were going to be, sharing in this power of this new kingdom when it came in. But just to back up a moment and talk about the wider gendered context, gender and masculinity was massively important in antiquity, both within a Jewish context, but also within the wider Roman world. And I think this is where we start to see some of this interaction on that level of ideology playing out, because gender wasn't something that just happened, in a kind of contained way, but gender cut across the protocols, and masculinity cut across the protocols of power, class, economy, as we've sort of already been discussing about heads of household and so on. Like, these gendered roles had actual economic and social understandings to the very fabric of those societies, right up all the way up to the top, where the Roman emperor Caesar would be understood as the most manly of men, the head of the household of Rome, the ultimate kind of father figure, and also the Roman Empire itself could be envisaged. So nations could be envisaged along these gender dynamics, with Rome as this conquering masculine entity going out and bringing others into the fold of this dominant masculine power, by subjugating it and humiliating its defeated enemies. And even the gendered coding of crucifixion does this as well.
That was going to be a question. Yeah.
It's primarily a violent method of execution that displays the victim, naked and penetrated and exposed and humiliated. It's a ritual humiliation, and that's exactly the intent, to inscribe Roman patriarchal and masculine power onto the defeated, emasculated body of a foreign subject.
So I want to press on that because there's something really good here, and I'm going to have to skip a bunch of questions just so we have time to take others' questions before we let you both go. But you mentioned crucifixion and gendered roles. Rome is the unpenetrable. I mean, obviously, crucified victims are, or maybe they're not victims. Maybe they are violent criminals or whatever it might be, depending on whose perception you're looking through, right? But Jesus is being crucified, and I've had scholars come on who want to say cognitive dissonance in totality explains the earliest movement in terms of he gets killed, they didn't expect it, holy mackerel, boom, how do we understand this, and trying to make sense of this stuff, maybe post-traumatic stress or some type of trauma, they didn't sleep well, they probably didn't eat well, boom, they're having visions, Jesus is still alive to them, and now he's still alive, and here's the start of the movement. You've mentioned in this episode so far that you think maybe he goes knowing he's going to die. Maybe the earliest movement thought that maybe they knew he was going to die. Would there still be the shock factor of, oh my gosh, our man was completely humiliated with the gender roles in mind? How do you understand this? Like, can you imagine your person being that humiliated and with the mindset that they're carrying? I don't know.
Well, I think this is where you get an interesting crossover in terms of those gender dynamics and how they could be understood in that kind of martyrdom context. So the Jesus movement, we suggest, began to develop certain ideas about death, because death, as we saw with John the Baptist, was a real possibility for these sorts of seditious movements that were popular. So the idea that it was completely unexpected just doesn't make sense. Even if it wasn't expected, it's still a possibility. It's still on the horizon. It's not as if people didn't regularly get crucified, and particularly popular figures like Jesus or John the Baptist or others. But we suggest that the early Jesus movement quite likely adopted these ideas or developed a theology of martyrdom, which was also understood in this gendered way of taking the punishment like a man. So kind of showing your masculinity and your bravado by displaying, your threshold for pain and going into it in this kind of morally virtuous way. As with gender in any context in society, it can be messed with, it can be reconfigured or redefined in certain ways that are useful for whoever's doing that kind of redefinition. And we think that the early Jesus movement quite likely developed these ideas of, well, actually, we can turn a humiliating death into a great thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think you get these in competition, don't you? It will be straight away, it's an emasculating thing. One response is, no, it's not, it's hyper-masculine, and so on and so forth. So all sorts of ideas that for one person could be seen as emasculating can be seen as a masculine idea. So, it could be even things like, I'm going a little off here, but if you think of stuff about celibacy, for instance, one sense, why haven't you got a family? Why haven't you got this? You're not acting like a man should. On the other hand, the celibate figure will say, well, this is heroic strength I'm showing. Like you mentioned the virgins before. This is a reason why you call them virgins. I think some of the virgins have turned up in the comments.
What's the reason, Jay?
But you know what I mean. I've got an SE. There you go. So there's all these competing ideas about masculinity going on, and they could exist simultaneously. I think is one of the key things. The people have perception could be there straight away. The crucifixion almost immediately would have been interpreted in different ways for different people.
Oh, there's so much. Okay, so here a couple more, and then I'm going to take the super chats from anybody who has questions. Judas betraying Jesus. Question: do you think that Judas' betrayal of Jesus is hysterical? Yeah. Or is it historical? And what were his motives? I'm going to tell you my honest thoughts. I think this is fiction. But I think that Paul's thinking of God as the one who's turning over Jesus, even though I could see why someone could narrate it. I don't know, though. I'm just throwing out there like my personal thoughts. Do you think it's historical?
I don't know. I think it's difficult to establish one way or another. I wouldn't be confident on either way. I think I think it's an early tradition without a doubt. There's Semitic elements to it in terms of the name. Iscariot probably means man of Kerioth, and the argument has been made that Kerioth is to the south and outside of Galilee, so you've got an outsider, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's possible, but it could also equally be possible that they make this up as a story to explain why it happened or whatever. So I mean, with a lot of this stuff, we don't go into precise details about proving these things because I think ultimately on all of it, it's very difficult to prove whether this happened or didn't happen in many, many cases. I'm confident in certain cases that stuff is later, reflects later ideas. We prefer to talk about early tradition rather than Jesus did or didn't do this or Judas did or didn't exist. Well, so were these ideas likely around in Galilee, in Judea around this time, or were they reflective of later ideas? That's the way we would work on this, rather than we can prove Jesus did say this or didn't do that. And because I think that's all you can do with a lot of this stuff, because it's very, very. I mean, we've got to remember what have we got? We've got Mark's Gospel. Okay, we've got. I think we think Q is material particular to Matthew and Luke, and really that's it. Years after Jesus' death, doesn't really matter if you want to say 10 or 50 years after Jesus' death. This is a long time, so I think it's very, very difficult to say anything with any certainty about what happened or what didn't happen. What we have to do is talk about, were these ideas early or were these ideas late? Were these ideas associated with that part of the world or were they associated with another part of the world? And I think we have to be sort of general and vague like that. That's the best we can do. And Judas, I think, fits into that. So that's why I'm not. I can see for and against on Judas, but I don't think you can't prove it either way.
Okay. Question here: what happened at the trials for Jesus? How historical are the accounts? Is this one of those you're not sure either?
The trial. Oh, I think the trial. I mean, there was presumably some sort of trial, but the trial of Jesus is, I think, is deliberately presented as a mistrial, a kangaroo court, as Helen Bond put it. It's shown at night when it shouldn't be. I think it's designed to show that this was a. If I was going to bet on it, it would be to show that an innocent man has died. It was all completely wrong. So I'm very skeptical about the trial of Jesus.
Thank you. And what happened to Jesus's body, and how good is the evidence? And I ask, we're in your chapter 10 here, of course, with this question, but I tend to go right now with Richard C. Miller on this particular whole missing body trope that I find, and being this is Greek writing, Jesus's body's missing. So I'm thinking, what's going on here? Did a translation take place? A translation fable? I imagine, probably. But do you take a stand on the missing body or the burial of Jesus?
I'll hand over to Robert on this one. He likes his burials.
All the dead bodies and beating up on people.
I think similar to what James was saying before, it's hard to come down one way or the other on the traditions of the body and the tomb. Mm-hmm. The earliest traditions that we have on this in the letters of Paul, if we're going to date Paul before the Gospels, don't mention a tomb, right? So if we're going with standard dating of the Gospels, the whole idea of Joseph of Arimathea providing this elaborate rock-cut tomb and so on comes rather late. And then also when you compare the different Gospel accounts, if you put them in the order in which the Gospels were likely written, you see this elaboration right through to an embellishment right through to John's one where Jesus is given the greatest tomb ever kind of thing, like it's a really fancy tomb, and this is a way of, I think, the author honoring Jesus also in death, which would have been the idea behind providing this tomb. On honestly, I think similarly to what James was saying, one way or the other, it's actually difficult to come down on a firm. I think one thing that I would add to what James was saying was that we're not, or at least for me personally, I'm not so much interested in the kind of apologetics approach to historical Jesus research. Like, we're much more interested in, what's plausible, what's early, what's likely, what makes sense within that historical context and that material setting. I think that the empty tomb narrative does make sense, precisely because within a material class setting, precisely because poor people like Jesus weren't put in a tomb. So, well, I mean, this argument can go both ways. You can see how it goes both ways. Poor people weren't put in a tomb, so this is why we have the story of Joseph of Arimathea, who is a wealthy man, powerful man who wants to honor Jesus in death and so on. Maybe this was an early example of a success story of their mission to the rich, but it's just difficult to know either way.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to stop with my questions. I mean, I really wanted to ask, like, as a summation of what you did, but I don't know. How much time do you have, Dr. Crossley?
All the time in the world.
Oh, that's...
Until the glorious revolution.
Well, that's not going to happen probably, so I'm just kidding. So let me ask my final question, and get your questions in before the 1,000 years is up, because it's been almost 1,000 years. What happened to the Jesus movement? I mean, I put on the thumbnail some guy, just some random guy with, like, looking like he's dressing like he's some, like, I don't know, apocalyptic figure. I don't know. That was my imagination when I created the thumbnail. And this is a failed revolution. But Christianity didn't stop. If anything, it has flourished and continued to grow. And I'm not saying it isn't on a decline today with more enlightened thinking and being critical of things, in my opinion. But something happened to it. I mean, it was this kind of idea that we're painting about Jesus and what we've been talking about, the earliest Jesus movement. There's no way I can imagine that surviving. What happened to it? Dr. Crossan said it relocated from Galilee to Jerusalem, then from Jerusalem out into the known world. If it would have stayed in Galilee, it would have gone extinct. If it would have stayed in Jerusalem, it would have gone extinct. He said if it didn't relocate, it wouldn't have flourished. Maybe you have some other things you'd like to paint as to why it succeeded and it became what it did.
Well, I think generally, obviously true, but I would say there's I'm sure he would say there's much more to the story than that. It clearly and quickly spread among different material interests. So I mean, I think this is why I think this mission to the rich is important. Already from the very beginnings, it's got connections with more elite circles. Already it's got networks across the sea or the Lake of Galilee, whether it's through fishing, whether it's through tax collectors. When you got to, if the Passover means that you've got people coming from all over the spot, and anyone connected there means the message gets spread quite quickly. If it stays, once you've got the idea of going around the Mediterranean world, you've got synagogues which include Jews and interested Gentiles as a ready-made network right across there. The idea that they saw the Jesus risen from the dead. I'm not making any claim that this was a supernatural act or anything like that, but clearly people believed they saw Jesus risen from the dead, gives that immediate justification. So you've got all those networks in place, which I think are crucial. And networks, as I said before, are absolutely essential for ideas to spread. And other factors, we know that it's clear that women heading households play an important role, which is not a big surprise. We know about elite women being interested in philosophy and things aside from the husband, who could inherit a household once the husband's gone away. These are points of connection in the city, in towns and things across the Mediterranean world. I think, though, how do we get from a movement that's clearly a Jewish movement to a movement that becomes a predominantly Gentile one is the striking question. I think, for instance, the mission to sinners is also important here. not only does it give you that give access to across social economic class, the term sinners is also a term used for Gentiles. So you've got ready-made justification for interaction and spread of a message among Gentiles. Now, if you think of, for instance, in synagogues, they'll be interested. We know there are Gentiles interested in Judaism at synagogues. They will go from synagogue. They will go to their other households with other networks straight away. Paul, as a tent maker, will meet people there. Trades associations and things will have their own family networks. And we do know that these networks are crucial for Christianity to emerge. So, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 7, we know that Paul has to deal with the idea of a believing partner and an unbelieving partner. So you've got already there's tensions taking place among families. Factor into this, you've got all that idea about coming kingdom and so on and so forth. And once this movement has spread significantly and become embedded in the Roman Empire at large, you've got the idea of this new empire, and you can talk about. I mean, in one sense, it's crazy to think Jesus movement becomes the movement of empire. On another level, though, you are talking about new empires all the time in the Jesus tradition. So it's not a massive leap to shift from wanting this new empire of God, kingdom of God, dictatorship of God, to use that ideology to talk about the Roman Empire. But you've got that tension. You've got that tension between rich and poor, giving up your wealth, caring for the poor, and so on and so forth. And so simultaneously, you've got the language of power, empire, and so on, alongside the reaction to it. And this is what happens, obviously, in medieval Europe, for instance. You've got Christianity provides the language of authority, the language of Christendom, the language of power, but it also provides the language of resistance to it in peasant uprisings or whatever. So, for instance, my favorite example is the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. On the one hand, you've got the lords, the elite, and someone talking about the whole ordered world of Christendom. On the other hand, you have lower clergy saying we need to overthrow these people in the name of Jesus, the Bible, and so on and so forth. So that tension's been built there from the beginning, but it's not a massive leap, I don't think, to think that this could also become the religion of empire.
So obviously geographic location, as Crossley said, but there's this spread amongst social groups into a new group of sinners or Gentiles. Would you say that the message also radically changed from the Jesus movement's message to getting into Paul's message? And I'd love to maybe just a brief comment on that, but also the idea that they're using the hierarchical structure of Rome, using kind of Jesus as the new Caesar, all of these things, they're kind of co-opting the language. And eventually Christians, when they actually start to become popular and you have an emperor who really is the emperor of Rome, whoa, this was already paving the way. Like, duh, we are the very new kingdom that was prophesied.
You can see how that connection, and you've got to remember this is happened. Some of the developments happened rapidly because Paul, in the middle of the first century, is now in a situation where he has to deal with a significant number of non-Jews being part of this movement. How do you justify them? Well, Paul says it's no longer by works of the law, it's by faith and things like this. And so, when you get into the second century, this is, I mean, you don't want to put numbers on it just yet, but obviously in the long run, this becomes overwhelmingly a Gentile religion, not a Jewish one. And hence you get the tension and competition with Jews and Judaism, and identifying this movement and this figure over against Judaism, which wasn't there in the beginning. So that's the real difference in some ways. There's no way the Jesus movement would have envisaged that, but that's the way it turned out.
I'd love to chime in here and just say, so that this language of the failed revolution of the early Jesus movement, that we use as a subtitle in the final chapter, I think, we're actually responding there. I don't think we name him. I'm not sure if we do or not, but to a well-known scholar, N.T. Wright, or Bishop Tom Wright, who has a popular book published a couple of years ago called "The Day the Revolution Began," and it basically says that when Jesus died on the cross, it inaugurated this revolution that is still continuing to this day, and by that he means church or something like this. And part of my background that I was talking about earlier, in terms of earlier work I've done, is criticizing scholars, especially scholars like Wright, who take this loaded political language and kind of extract all the political potency out of it, or turn it into this weird, playful, gestural, So yes, there was a revolution, but it was a revolution of the heart, or something like this, right?
Yeah.
And so when we say the failed revolution, what we're talking about is that what the earliest Jesus movement were thinking and doing and organizing around, which was before Paul got involved, it was about reversing the material hierarchies in Galilee and Judea, which had been upset by those building projects, by the elites. They thought that God was going to dramatically intervene, reverse those material hierarchies, and inaugurate this golden age. That didn't happen. So the revolution that they were expecting didn't happen. What we were left with was all this millenarian language and apocalyptic ideas and a kind of shifting context. So the inclusion of Gentiles, as James is saying, shifts in power base, shifts from rural Galilee into more urban environments and so on, different concerns. And so the movement and its ambitions and aims changed. But as James said, it still had that imperial language of both critique, which could also be turned on its head to use to support empire. And so, maybe a revolution happens a few centuries later when the Roman Empire itself becomes, the empire of God, as it were. But it's not the revolution that the earliest Jesus movement had in mind. Or it's not. I mean, maybe it is. I don't know. That's debatable. But what I think is interesting beyond that is how through, the next 2,000 years, the remnants of this early millenarian movement in its initial kind of social organizing around quite specific material contextual conditions within Galilee and Judea, it's been transported, and these ideas have provided impetus and justification for a whole load of other both revolutionary and reactionary movements. So through 2,000 years of history, people appeal to the same traditions and the same language to both uphold structures of power, but also to rebel against them. And we find that particularly interesting from a historical materialist point of view.
It's almost like what Crossley said. He's like, you get this, he looks at it from an evolutionary standpoint, and he likes to kind of use this picture as an evolutionary one. Are we a sustainable species? He always says. And he uses this model of something like you're saying that keeps repeating of what builds up and what breaks down these kind of societies. And he thinks the message of Jesus is a good one, to give to the poor, to anti kind of capitalist approach. But that's a whole nother side chat, and I don't want to get lost in there. Let's get to the super chats for you. For the sake of Dr. Crossley, he's going to end up skull and bones sitting there for like waiting for me to finish. Hangfa Shi, thank you so much for the super chat. If the more legit kingdom, a historical Yeshua was on about is the one to come, where does the one within come in? This is actually what I was going to make the point that you just said, Robert, and that was, what obviously the Jesus movement kingdom was meant to be a literal, physical, real kingdom. But then we get this Luke idea. It sounds like it's in you. The kingdom is in you and stuff. That redefinition or renegotiation of the term, where does that come from?
Well, I think there's a long tradition of both ideas held in tension, or maybe not tension. Just take the book of Daniel, for instance. You can talk about the kingdom that's to come and the kingdom that's present, where God rules in the here and now, but God will intervene in the future to make everything wonderful or whatever. And to set up a new kingdom, an everlasting kingdom, and or through his agent or whatever, something like that. So those two ideas can be held in tension anyway. There's not, or at least it's not perceived to be a problem. There is an argument I have some sympathy with, but it's not a perfect argument, that Luke is now trying to dampen the expectation of the future and push more for this idea that this saying you talk about within you would be an example of Luke pushing that idea more than the imminence of a kingdom or whatever. There is if in Luke 21 you get, I think, a bit of this as well, a little bit more of the dampening of the hard eschatological expectation you get in Mark 13 and in Matthew 24. So I mean, I don't think it's a perfect argument, because I'm still not 100% convinced Luke is completely hostile to imminent eschatology, but I think there are hints of it in Luke, and that would be the best explanation for it, because we do know that the movement has problems with these expectations. 2 Peter chapter 2 or the end of John's Gospel clearly has the idea that this worry about the second coming not happening and things like this.
Yeah.
So,
I think we even see, like, right through the New Testament, this adjusting of the imminent apocalyptic expectations. You know, the blueprint. It wasn't a blueprint as such, but the blueprint that had been laid out wasn't quite going to plan. And so they're readjusting, they're readapting their ideas in terms of this new context. Arguably the earliest, or one of the earliest texts in the New Testament, 1 Thessalonians, this is already a concern. So people have died. People who are in Christ have died. But, you know, there's confusion, because wasn't God going to come back? What happens to those people who have already died? And so Paul has to say, well, you know, that they'll be caught up as well. Don't worry about it. They're still saved. But, you know, like, there was this expectation that in the interim, like, this was going to happen soon, immediately, right? So by the time you get to Luke, which could have been written late first century, possibly early second, it hasn't happened. So you've got constant kind of redefinitions, and I think the tension between the imminent transformation of this real existing kingdom coming to earth in the here and now versus something that can, you know, it really gets pushed out.
I agree with you. I think it's really interesting. Paula Fredrickson phrased it this way when I saw her in person. She said, Paul's late. And I'm like, hold on, what? Now she's not saying, I mean, obviously that's our earliest source material, but it's like, what do you mean he's late? She's like, he's actually late in terms of the whole, like, when all the resurrection of the dead, all of that was already supposed to happen. That's why they're having problems. It's hard for us, without being scholarly about it, to wrap our heads around that. Like, this guy is trying to fix a problem about something that hasn't already happened, and he's the earliest voice that we have. That's a big problem for any, like, radical fundamentalists or evangelicals that want to, like,
it's a huge problem. I think, we're talking mid-first century, and this is a problem. And of course it's going to be a problem if you've got early, and this is why I think the idea of the earliest Jesus movement, historical Jesus, if you want to use that term, being an eschatological prophet, millenarian figure, or whatever, is one of the strong arguments, because already by the 50s the problems are happening. Very early on the problems are happening, and I mentioned John, the end of John's Gospel, and 2 Peter chapter 3.
Hold on, you keep breaking up every time you say that. It's like, say that again. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. The end of John's Gospel and 2 Peter chapter 3,
Got it.
where they're really late in this sense. I mean, it's happened. They know the stuff hasn't come true, and now they're having to explain it away. So in the case of John's Gospel, it's, well, if I was going to come back, it's not I would. And in the case of 2 Peter 3, it's like, for the Lord, one day is like 1,000, and so on. So then you go at the point where it's not happening right now. We're explaining it in a different way. Paul may be late in the sense that this should have happened, but there's still time. There, in the sense that, a whole generation have died off now. It's not time.
I love this whole failed apocalyptic thing, by the way. It's actually one of my last legs I was standing on inside of Christendom before I ended up leaving, because it was the study of last things. And the study of last things was the last thing I studied. And once I figured out, wow, we should have looked at this sooner. I didn't know this thing failed. Continuing, Margaret de Velden says, there would be violence, taking power from the Romans or from other Jews. What was the plan?
Well, there would be a shift in leadership. So the current elite, who were Jews installed by Rome in Galilee and Judea, such as Herod Antipas and Pilate in Judea, they're out, and Jesus is in as the new King of Kings, Lord of Lords, with a Politburo of other prominent members of the Jesus movement, as the seconds in charge and so on. And I think we see evidence of this kind of organization from pretty early. In Mark's gospel, we have the story about, will we sit on your left or your right? Like there's and that we've got arguments in the book about technical arguments about why we think that particular tradition is very early. And it seems that they were envisaging, this new kingdom where Jesus and these other prominent members would be sitting on thrones, judging Israel and the nations.
That's why, like, it goes back to the age old, and I'd love to get your take on this, is that, who's guilty, right? You see this become anti-Semitic, the anti-Jewishness of the Gospel of John.
Well, to flip that on its head and to be a bit more specific, it's imagined as a Jewish theocracy. The God of Israel is technically in charge, who will install his loyal subjects or Jesus as co-regent and so on, and other loyal prominent Jews. And Israel will be returned to a place of ongoing predominance among the nations. So Rome's day is out, and Israel is going to be the kind of the prime kingdom or nation of the world.
And this would mean kicking out the Jews that are playing with Rome too, correct?
Right, because they're sinners.
Got it.
They're lawbreakers. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Chris. Good to see Chrissy here. Should we be careful in assigning Jesus to an economic class? Wasn't it typical of Greco-Roman biography that the hero often start from humble origins, like Romulus, for instance? Should we perhaps be skeptical of Tecton, Jesus? I don't want to comment. Go ahead, answer that question, because when I was in Sepphoris and they did all that reconstruction, there's a curious thing James Tabor said. We don't know, but he says, you kind of wonder if Jesus was a Tecton around this time, did he lay some of these bricks? And it makes you wonder, anyway, but go ahead.
Well, certainly there were ideas of stories about humble origins. There's biblical stories of humble origins as well. Shepherd and all this kind of thing, and the story in story of Saul or whatever. But just because there's a pre-existing narrative doesn't mean to say that something behind it isn't true or not, or accurate or whatever. If we think of the Jesus movement as a product of what's happening in Galilee, then the idea of associating it with a tecton is not unreasonable. The proving this is very difficult, but what we can see in the gospel tradition is that this is actually a bit of a problem. Jesus as a tecton, he's not as scribe as he should be, as certainly Luke does not want this to be the case. Luke, in the passage where Mark presents Jesus as this artisan figure, Luke turns him into the ultimate scribe. We get complaints in the gospel tradition about him not being a proper scribe. Mark doesn't seem to care too much. Matthew puts it onto Joseph a little bit. This is the son of the tecton, and things like that. So there is evidence in Chris Keith's book, Jesus and the Scribal Elite. I can't remember the bloody title of it now, but it's something like that. Makes this case pretty well. That there
I'm calling him right now and telling him you didn't get it right. No, I'm just kidding.
He can complain all he wants. He knows get from it. And Jesus against the Scribal Elite, I think it is. I don't know. He's not watching. Makes this case well that there is a scribalization of Jesus, and this idea that he is this tecton is a bit of a problem early on. Now that takes us back to an early tradition, is what I would say, that later gospel writers had to deal with. Can you ultimately prove it? Well, no. But
it fits the parables though a lot too.
Yeah, I mean the whole stuff is associated with agrarian context, and tecton is a lot broader than certainly not necessarily carpenter. The other explanation is working with stone. Really, it's, I think, something like artisan is the better translation, something general worker. And we get stories about how the tecton is the person who keeps the world running, whilst the thinker in the city is the one who does all the clever elite thinking and all this kind of thing. They're two different people, different types. So I think there's a strong case that you would say Jesus was, or the early movement was associated with these kinds of people is a reasonable one in Galilee. If they're associated with the Galilean peasantry, as looks likely, trying to do a mission to the rich or whatever, I think a movement associated with a tectone as its leader is plausible. Quite what we can say about what Jesus did, well, I defer to what I said before. A lot of this stuff is, we have to do the best guesses we can for the earliest possible ideas.
Yeah, I think I'd just quickly add to that this, it kind of harks back to that thing about when class is talked about in historical Jesus research, when it is talked about, and it's hardly ever talked about, it's often reduced to this kind of personal idiosyncrasy. So what was Jesus's class position, rather than talking about the broader class conflicts that he was caught up in? So, despite our uncertainty, I mean, it seems reasonable, it seems likely, there's good arguments to be made that Jesus was a tectone. But our argument doesn't hinge and die on whether he was or not.
Right.
These broader social forces and class conflicts were still happening, irrespective of Jesus's personal class location. So if we can't kind of nail that down precisely, although I think there's good reason, as James was outlining, why we can, but even if we can't, it's not the end of a class analysis at all.
It's interesting. I think of the parables where he talks about chief cornerstone and stuff like that, which makes me, I mean, you can come up with all sorts of stuff because you've got him talking about vineyards and you got him talking about this, but it makes me wonder if he is just tecton, is he saying something like a stonemason would know? But then again, I like the broader idea because maybe this person knows about stonemasonry and knows about vineyards and knows about who knows what. So
this is it, right? Like the language that these teachings and these ideas are being communicated in are stories concerning fishing, agriculture, building. This is a movement of workers, right? They're not talking about issues of so it's all caught up in political language, but they're not talking about the high political issues of the day, like town planning, how much military occupation you need to keep the populace calm, these sorts of issues. The teachings are communicated in this way, that they're talking about the concrete lives of ordinary agrarian workers living in a kind of peasant culture or context.
Did you look like you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, I think it's important to compare what happens in Greco-Roman biographies about the origins of people. It's important to compare what happens to the origins of David or whatever as well in the Bible. I mean, these are all influential stories and influential narratives, but we've got influential stories of people who come from prominent backgrounds as well. So we shouldn't get too caught up in narrative styles because they are there, but because something is cast into a certain narrative style doesn't necessarily mean there's no historical reality behind it, or it doesn't prove or disprove it. It
right.
Just shows people cast these things in narrative styles in different ways. That's all it does, I think, ultimately.
It's like the biggest issue I've discovered as a layperson getting into your scholarship, everybody's scholarship, that I've been studying. It's like I get pulled back and forth. I'll hear someone who's trying to make a case that it is true and it really happened, or there's a historical kernel, and then next thing you know, the next person comes in with a great literary exposition on it, and I'm like, did it happen or did it not happen? And it's like, at the very least, I can walk away and say, okay, the author is well aware of verisimilitude. At the very least, they are acquainted with the world and social structures that fit. If it was historical, that doesn't mean it is. And so that you've got sometimes they're wrong. Luke will get some things wrong historically, but it's one of those things. I just sit back and go, it lowers your confidence on obviously a faith certainty perspective. Like, I am certain this happened. If you're like a believer who needs that to be the case, you're going to come and hit a brick wall. But if you are more like historical research, like we're doing, trying to figure out what is and isn't, like Chris is doing, trust me, Chris is sharp like we are, you're not going to have that issue. Anyway, Hengfa Shi, again, what kind of weapons would his followers be equipped with? Armor, like what types of weapons would be available? Greek swords or Roman, Egyptian? The early swords.
There's discussion over types of knives and length of knives and things like this. That wouldn't be unusual, let's put it that way, to carry it for protection, because look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, for instance. Man gets the shit kicked out of him for wandering stupidly down a path when he shouldn't. I mean, it's going to happen. I mean, I'm not an expert on ancient weaponry, but I know people who are. But I guess there's different types of knives that have been discussed as one possibility, of where a knife ends and a sword begins. I don't know, but little beyond my expertise in what types of weapons, sadly, because I'm kind of nice. It's because I haven't researched it really, but if I have an explanation that I'm kind, it's better.
He's too nice.
We don't touch on that in the book, but it's actually a really interesting question. I might look into it myself at some point.
Right now,
I don't know about armor. I'm trying to think, and I don't think there's any. I mean, we've got there's the whole metaphor that, like, Paul often uses these military metaphors of, the armor of, but the earliest followers of Jesus, I'm not sure if we have any evidence that they armored up, they suited up or anything. Not sure.
It's an interesting one. I'd love to have you both write further on that. We got a couple more, and then I'll let you both go. John Muir, forgive me for butchering your name if I did. How should we look at the contrast between Jesus and Barabbas in the context of a revolutionary Jesus movement? I thought it was fiction, just the whole act of it. But what are your guys' thoughts? Like, what do you think?
This is another one of those really difficult ones. I mean, I think the whole passion narrative is caught up in rewriting. It becomes very, very difficult to start talking about fact or fiction, or certainly fact anyway. I think what you can do with the Barabbas story, though, is to show it's about a miscarriage of justice, in a way that the gospel writers are presenting. So the trial, I think, of Jesus is presented as a quite overt miscarriage of justice, and so is the crucifixion. So it's the person who does look like he's the violent revolutionary subversive who gets let off, whereas Jesus, who's meant to be innocent, doesn't. Who gets the death that Barabbas should have got, and things like this. And of course, as I guess people know, Barabbas is son of a father. So there's all sorts of things going on there. So I think that certainly the way it's framed is about innocence of Jesus, and I think you get a lot of this in. I think you certainly get it in Mark. Discussions that we are not a violent subversive movement. The death of John the Baptist in Mark 6 is like this. It's John the Baptist is an innocent victim, nothing to do with any of that violent stuff. He's just innocently killed because of what is presented as manipulative women. So it gives a degree of innocence, a lot of innocence to John the Baptist. I think even gives some to Herod Antipas. I mean, there's a very peculiar story, and why it does that is another question. And I think you get something similar happening with about the crucifixion. It's to flag up, we're not a group, don't persecute us, don't kill us, we are innocent, that kind of thing. So, but quite what's behind it, I mean, I think it's so much entangled with all that kind of apologetics going on. I mean, I think it's really, really difficult. And the other issue with the Passion is, of course, I mean, it is written up in light of the Hebrew Bible and scriptures and fulfillment of prophecy that becomes so difficult to start disentangling all that.
And I was thinking about an early source that we have that has Jesus and Jesus Barabbas. So a lot of some of the scholars have actually tried to make the argument, like, Jesus Barabbas, what the heck is going on here? So you have two Jesuses, and one is the violent one, and one is the innocent one. And they thought maybe this is a hint at the sacrificial, like a kind of a rewrite of a sacrifice in the Old Testament here. But anyway, I didn't know if that whole, the textual variant having Jesus Barabbas, which is early, if that played any role in your mind.
Well, I think it's a similar kind of argument. I mean, Bar Abbas, I think it's one of the explanations. I think probably the best explanation is play on the Aramaic son of a father. So it is play, as in Jesus is son of God and so on. So it is playing on a parallel between the two of them in some ways. But the wrong one gets, one's unfairly killed, the other one's unfairly let off, I guess.
Can I just chime in and just say that in the book, James is exactly right in terms of how we start there, but then we say, but look, irrespective of what actually happened during this trial and in terms of Barabbas, we then go into this quite nuanced discussion about what the text reveals about the kind of the crowd dynamics and the different like social forces and upheavals that we're going. So we can still have a quite general discussion about those sorts of dynamics that I think is really revealing about, why Jesus would be put to death, what kind of things were going on.
Mm-hmm.
Had there been an uprising? Had there been an attempted uprising around Passover? Because there are sort of hints of that within the tradition. Get the book and you can see kind of a more nuanced exploration of that. Yeah.
And that just to ask, was that even a practice? Do we have any historical reference we could go to show that they would release somebody like this?
I don't think so.
Exactly as it's suggested. There's stories about pardoning certain people, but this one is as an actual practice. No, but it could be based on earlier stories about pardoning certain criminals, but not as a standard practice. Not as far as we know.
Thank you. Last one.
Just within kind of cross-cultural studies of crowds, the idea of kind of releasing a sacrificial victim to satiate the anger of the crowd. So this is something that anthropologists have written about cross-culturally in terms of kind of crowd dynamics and this sort of thing. So this adds another really interesting lens on the whole discussion.
Thank you for that. Imnag, thank you for the beautiful, wonderful super chat, helping us out here at MythVision. Is there any stories in the Bible, Old or New Testament, that's original to Jewish writing, or is everything just copies of other stories? This is this is outside of the book, obviously.
Well, I mean, in one sense, yes and no. I mean, nothing's original anywhere, but also there's usually cultural particularity and peculiarity. So you will find, no doubt, all sorts of parallels to biblical stories in Asia Minor, Mediterranean, or whatever. I mean, in terms of the recognizable forms, the one that's already been given would be biography. The common argument is that the Gospels reflect Greco-Roman biography. I'm sure that's true. And they're given their own, and they work within these traditions within their own cultural context. So the Jesus story will be infused with all sorts of ideas about Jewish exegesis and so on and so forth. And you could say it's a number of Jewish texts, Christian texts, any text across the ancient world. So I mean, these things are all integrated in one level. There are similarities across cultures. There's nothing truly unique anywhere, really. But people use recognizable cultural forms, genres, and so on to make a point that is meaningful in their own context, but also understandable within a broader context, I think is the way I would frame that.
I think relatedly, I often get asked about, was the historical Jesus unique or original or what have you? And I think some people get challenged by historical analysis, and particularly the way we do it, because we're wanting to compare Jesus and the early Jesus movement to other ideas that were around at the time, other traditions, other social movements, right? So we're constantly making these comparisons, which is actually what I think good historical work needs to do. It needs to put it in that context. And the answer, I think, is that from a historical perspective, as James said, nothing is actually unique. I mean, everything is unique and nothing's unique. I'm unique, but I'm also, I share a lot of things in common with other people. And I think it's the same with Jesus. What was unique about Jesus was the specific combination of things that he shared in common with other groups, people, and so on. And I think the same can be said about the texts in the Bible.
That was why I guess literally last thing I'm going to say and ask, and it's pretty much your thoughts based on your research, everything you've both dove into. Why Jesus? I mean, you had John the Baptist die. Why wasn't there like a cult that surrounded him in the same way of him resurrecting? Why did they think he rose from the dead and not John or Theodus or Judas the Galilean or whoever died? Do you have a personal opinion in your research as why they thought it was this guy and not anyone else?
Well, didn't Herod think that Jesus might be John the Baptist raised back to life? Like the idea that that even people coming back to life was unique to Jesus is simply not true.
Or Nero, right? Nero redivivus.
Right.
So there's this.
Right. So these ideas existed both within and outside of Jewish contexts. I suppose it's one of those difficult questions where, we're looking at this question through the legacy of 2,000 years of Christianity and Jesus being, this legendary figure and so on. And it's kind of hard to explain. Well, why? But and then I kind of want to turn the question on its head. Well, why does there need to be a reason? Why does it have to be something to do with Jesus himself or with something that was distinctive about that movement that led to it? This was just the combination of the social and historical forces that came together in a particular way and produced this particular phenomenon, and that's what happened. Right. So what?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think we shouldn't get. I mean, it was an important moment. I think that they believed that Jesus didn't die and was. Jesus didn't die. Sorry, Jesus was resurrected.
Right.
So the movement could continue. John the Baptist movement continued though without necessarily belief in resurrection or anything like this. But anyway, nonetheless, there is to give another shameful plug. Shameless. Who cares?
We're all shamed in here. What? You want me to share the screen?
No, because I've got too much shit on here. Nothing bad.
Mary Magdalene in lingerie.
It's late night. It's late night.
Right. There's a big project with a book coming out next year called The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus, where we're pushing together a number of scholars of different perspectives, try to push some different questions on it. And this was one of the very questions we asked is, what about other movements? And there's a really interesting article by someone called Nathan Johnson who talks about the Scythians and their idea that they may have understood about had ideas about the leader surviving in whatever way and the movement lasting several centuries and then dying out. So I think you can have both things. You can have a movement where the key figure survives in some way, resurrection or whatever. You can have a movement where the figure dies, but the movement survives. I mean, you were talking before. You said, you hanged around in Christian circles despite, and it's eschatology that really got to you. But he's pretty clear the movement survived that.
Right.
Easily survived the problem that the second coming didn't happen in a generation, the kingdom didn't come. Wasn't that big a problem for its survival? So we've got to start thinking of, there's plenty of reasons why movements survive, social reasons, networks that I've talked about and things like this. They survive for various other reasons. I don't think we should get too hung up on the idea that it has to be a resurrected figure or whatever. There's always,
of course.
Yeah.
And I was just
that's where we are often.
Taking your materialistic approach, I was simply wondering if there was maybe certain components that you thought this might have been one of the reasons. And there's probably no way to know, right?
Yeah, that's the difficult thing. I mean, if I was going to speculate a little more, I'd probably repeat what I was saying. Some of it's by chance, but it taps into things that are happening, bigger, broader issues. So, I mean, the idea of a big overarching God is really developing in the ancient world. And once you've got something that can just tap into that, into these networks that exist around the Mediterranean, you've got this idea that a justification for going to different social groups and different ethnic groups. It's almost, I don't know when I push it too hard, but it's almost waiting to happen. And yeah, I think often unintentionally, this Christianity becomes the one for reasons that it didn't necessarily deliberately do, but it found itself in that kind of position perhaps as early as the mid-1st century, that it was starting to take off in a range of different networks, and it was there to justify or provide an option for people who were starting to believe similar things.
I want our audience to know that if you think we exhausted this book today, you would be wrong. Okay. There's so much more in this book. And trust me, we definitely did an airplane view. There's a lot we touched that is in the work, but there's so much detail, and you really need to get this work for two reasons. This can help you better understand the arguments leading up to the historical materialist approach on understanding the context and the best we can. If I'm going to give the best ability on knowing the historical Jesus and what's happening, this is it. This is your best guess. After that, it's up for grabs. I mean, there's no way. I can't see how we would get any closer to the guy if we're trying to find him. This is the book. Also, I want to have them back. So the way you can do that is purchase a copy. Let us know. Drop a comment if you've got the book on Amazon. I know right now it's $15.99 on Kindle, $29.95 right now on paperback. I hope people will check that out. You can also get it used, but if you want someone else's dirty fingerprints on that, you can go for it, but you can get a brand new one for a few extra bucks. Anyway, that's a shameless plug, right, guys?
Yeah.
Shameless plug.
Shameless and shameful. Love it.
I'm all about the shame. Yeah, I really hope that you will come back, and I hope this actually helps people to learn more about the topic. I like to engage in the debate, the discussion. Scholars who think there's more literary, less than literal or historical stuff. But I love the approach you take, and you're very balanced. You're not dogmatist on the historicist side. Notice I used the term historicist. That's probably a foreign term you're not used to hearing, but I have people who come on who think Jesus didn't exist at all. So people who believe there was a Jesus, they're called historicist, and people who aren't are mythicist. And so there's this debate that goes on. Of course, that would be the less popular view, but there's like the wrestling that goes on between both camps. And I didn't know, did you want to say one comment about what you think about the mythicist position? No comment.
I'll make a really quick comment, which is just to do with why I think the historical materialist approach is really important. So it's kind of it's not about the mythicist approach specifically, but it's more something that may have not been considered in enough detail, which is that the sources that we have, both the literary and the archaeological record, overwhelmingly come from the elite, or they preserve kind of the lives of the elite in history. So archaeology tends to be more monumental. The makeshift lives of itinerant figures, poorer figures and stuff, they get erased from history, right? So I think we need to be very, very careful about making claims about whether, and kind of what threshold or what level of historical evidence we need to say that non-elite figures in history, which are the overwhelming majority of people who have ever lived, were historical or not. We simply do not have the same, or we shouldn't expect to have the same levels of evidence about non-elite figures. So, this is a more general point just about how we do history, and that class-based questions are really important. Otherwise, we risk erasing the existence of poor people or non-elite people from history altogether. Do we want to do that?
Yeah, well, no. Okay, I will say something. I think it's only fair. I don't want to be flippant, and heaven forfend. But this is why we're keen to talk about. We're not that interested. Well, I'd be very interested if I could prove it, but we're not pushing the idea of the individual Jesus really here. We're talking about ideas and a movement that are early. The earliest tradition is what the way I would frame this. Partly because that's simply all you can do, in my opinion. Yeah. And I think in some levels, I think this sort of bypasses the mythicist versus historicist debate, because we're talking about ideas that are associated with Galilee and Judea, say around the year 30 or something like this. I'm not saying that there was a historical figure of Jesus who said the parable of the Good Samaritan or anything like that, but I think I could argue, for instance, there are certain ideas that are quite peculiar to early Judaism, have got absolutely zero interest in Gentiles. In fact, have got no real use for a Gentile audience. They've got bits of Aramaic, and very obvious, I think, in not many, but some cases, Aramaic stuff. And you bring all these ideas together, and you can make an argument of collective weight that this looks like it's a passage or a theme that goes back to, say, that was plausible in the 30s or 20s or whatever in Galilee, rather than some of the stuff that's more likely to come from Christianity at the turn of the 2nd century or something like that. So I prefer to think in terms of themes, ideas that would be early, peculiar to Jewish context, not really of any interest to Gentiles, non-Jews, and try to think of chronology of ideas. That's the way I would frame it. And that's what, so I try to bypass some of that. That may not be happy news for the historicists or the mythicists, but they can go on the internet and argue with themselves and things like that.
I love the way you.
That's where the virgins are, like I said.
I do like what you said, though.
One side of being more virgin than the other.
No, I get it. I get it. No, I appreciate it because the question can get old after a while. It's okay. I hope people will get your book. Go in the description. If you're watching this later, get the book. Check out their links. You can go to the websites as well. We give a little shameless plug again. There's the book. We have courses. If you haven't taken our courses, please check us out. I mean, you're missing out. 4K, really good content. I hope that you'll come and check us out on mvpcourses.com. That's in the description. We also have the Patreon, which is a little private family. That was actually, I know that looks kind of, you'd have to watch the video to get the point. But yes, she was a pastor. And now she's an OnlyFans worker. So we do all sorts of stuff here on MythVision. And
popular.
Right? You know, Dr. Matthew Munger actually goes to he works. Yeah, so there's all sorts of stuff. I had this one's Del Martin. We did a live stream with him on Sex and the Single Savior, talking about all sorts of fun stuff. Anyway, come check us out, support what we do, and leave a comment. Share this out with somebody else so they can get the book. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope both of you enjoyed this interview as well.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you. Stick around for 1 second as we do this little apocalyptic thing and final words with you, gentlemen.